Okay, guys, we've been graphing on paper in class, graphing exponential growth or decay functions. And here we're going to actually graph on Quizizz, which is a lot easier, a lot faster. Once you know the form y equals a parenthesis times a base to the power of x minus h, but we don't have minus h in Algebra 1, plus k, it'll be easy to graph if you understand this form. You see, the k value tells you your asymptote. And the asymptote is a horizontal line y equals whatever the k value is, okay? So in this case, since there is no k that's being added at the very end, technically your k value is 0, so your asymptote is the line y equals 0, okay? If you look at the graph, how it starts out, they have an asymptote right here at -3, and of course, based off of this k value of 0, you want it to be at 0, so take this asymptote and drag it up to be at the y value of 0. After that, you need some coordinates, right? So you would go to an XY table and you would plug in values. When we do it on paper, I say use consecutive integer inputs like -3, -2, -1, 0, 1, 2, 3, and then plug in an easy number like 0. So 3 to the 0 is 1, and 1 times 2 is 2. So you would get out a 2. And then you could use the growth factor of 3 to get to the next output. So that would be a 6, then times 3 would be 18. And we already know that 218 is way off the graph, so I'm not even going to bother continuing this way. You could go backwards. Instead of multiplying by 3 to get 6 and multiplying by 3 to get 18, by the way, because it's a growth factor of 3, multiplying by 3, going backwards would be dividing by 3 or multiplying by 1/3. 6 times 1/3 is 2. 2 times 1/3 would be 2/3, and 2/3 times 1/3 would be 2/9. But you don't even need to know this because it continues to get smaller and smaller and smaller, okay? Anyway, let's graph two nice coordinates like 0, 2, and 1, 6. So again, you want to move your asymptote to y equals 0. So you would take this line and move it up to the y equals 0 line. And then you would grab one of these dots, one of these two dots, and move one of them to a nice point 0, 2, 0, actually, yeah, 0, 2, drag it up to here, and you'd end up right there. And get the other point and move it to 1, 6. So this other coordinate's at 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Put it right there. So drag that one up to here. And with these two dots, it'll automatically curve it towards your asymptote. And that would be it. That would be your graph. So on paper, I would say if you did have a k value, ignore the k value, plot your points, and then shift them. But since Quizizz does a lot of the details of your graph for you, I would not ignore my k value. I would actually include it. So right here, we didn't have a k value, so it didn't make a difference. So let's look at another one that does have a k value that will make a difference. So on this one, once again, they give you this graph and you need to modify it so it could actually represent this graph. They're asking you to graph y equals the a value of -1 times a growth factor of 4 to the power of x plus the k value of 2. So right off the bat, you know your asymptote. Your asymptote is technically y equals that k value of 2. So y equals 2 is the asymptote. So you're going to graph this line. You see it's already graphed right here. What you're going to do is grab that line and drag it to the y value of 2. So drag it up to here and make it a horizontal line right here crossing at the y value of 2. I always draw it with the green line, but anyways, you're just going to drag it on Quizizz. You're going to grab this line with your cursor, move it up here, and it'll be right here at the y value of 2. Now, we need some more coordinates. So again, on paper, I would say to make an input-output table and plug in consecutive integer inputs. And normally, I would say ignore k, get your coordinates, and then shift them 2 units up. But since we only need 2 coordinates, we might as well include the k when we do the inputs and the outputs, okay? So we could take this value of 0, plug it in right here. 4 to the 0 is 1. 1 times -1 is -1. And -1 plus 2, including the k, -1 plus 2 is 1. So the input 0 gives us the output 1. And because we're including the k, that's an actual coordinate of our final graph. So if I went to 0, 1, and I took this one and went to 0 on the x, 1 on the y, and moved it right there, it would be this dot right there, okay? Now let's find another point, including the k value, the whole thing, right? So let's plug in the number 1. So 4 to the 1 is 4. 4 times negative 1 is negative 4. And negative 4 plus 2 is negative 2. So when I plug in a 1, I get out a negative 2. Now, again, let me remind you, on paper, I would say ignore k, graph this guy, and then shift your coordinates 2 units up. Right here, I'm actually including the k value, and I'm not using the growth factor right now. Okay, I'm actually just plugging in 0 into the whole thing, doing the math, getting out the output 1 when I plug in 0. Plug in 1, doing all the math, getting out negative 2. And that's all I need, 2 points. So move this first one to 0, 1. There it is. Now move the second one to 1, negative 2. So the second dot, move it to 1 and negative 1, 2, and put a dot right here. So that'd be right there. Put it in red better. And that with those 2 dots and with this asymptote, Quizizz will automatically draw your line like this. Okay? And that is the correct graph. Let's try another. Ladies and gentlemen, this one is an exponential decay function. Why? Because the growth factor, or the base, is less than 1. And you know when you multiply anything by half, it's going to decay. It's going to get smaller, okay? So let's graph this thing. First, let's understand that the k value is negative 8. So this asymptote that's at negative 3, it will be at negative 8. So if you wanted to, you could start by dragging this down to negative 8. And you'll end up with a asymptote right here at negative 8. And then, in addition to that, you need at least 2 points, right? Quizizz has 2 points right here. So you need 2 coordinates. So because we only need 2, I'm going to include the k value. I'm going to look at the whole thing, and I'm going to plug in, like let's say 0. Let's see what happens. When I plug in 0, 1/2 to the 0 is 1. 1 times 2 is 2, and 2 take away 8 is negative 6. So I'm going to take one of these and move it to 0, negative 6, and put a dot right there. And then I'm going to take another one simply by plugging in, like let's say the input 1. Plug in a 1 right there. 1/2 to the 1 is 1/2, and then 1/2 times 2 is 1, and 1 take away 8 is negative 7. So when I plug in a 1, I get out a negative 7. Okay. So 1 on the x, I take this one and go 1 on the x, negative 7 on the y, and it would be right there. And just with these 2 dots, Quizizz will graph it for you where it infinitely approaches that asymptote. And this way it'd go, I think, something like that. So just with those 2 coordinates, you'd be able to find that answer. The graph, the red one. Let's go for one more here. Again, we know that the asymptote is the line y equals the k value, which happens to be 3. So y equals 3. So right here, the asymptote is at y being negative 3. So go up to positive 3. Grab this one and drag it up to positive 3. And you're going to end up with your asymptote right here. And then you need at least 2 points. So how could you get 2 points? And again, because it's only 2 points that I'm finding, I'm going to go for an input-output table. And I'm going to include the k value. And I'm just going to plug in the simple value like 0. When I plug in 0, 1/2 to the 0 is 1. 1 times negative 4 is negative 4. Negative 4 plus 3 is negative 1. So we need another point. Let's plug in another value, kind of like 1. That's pretty easy to do. Plug in a 1 right there. 1/2 to the 1 is 1/2. 1/2 times negative 4 is negative 2. Negative 2 plus 3 is positive 1. So when I plug in a 1, I get out a 1. So take the first dot and move it to 0, -1, 0 on the x, -1 on the y. Move it down there. I want to drag it and make it a red dot. And then get this other dot and go to 1, 1. So that'd be 1 on the x, 1 on the y. So that just gets dragged to right there. And just by having the asymptote right here and these two dots right there, Quizizz will automatically draw it. See, from here to here, it's approaching that asymptote. It'll automatically curve it for you and graph it for you. So it's going to look something like this. And that's the correct graph. Okay, so when you're not doing it by paper, when you're not doing it on paper, I want you to include the k value because right here you only need 2 points. So go ahead and plug in 0, do the entire math, get out an answer, that's 1 point. Plug in another nice easy number like 1, do the whole math, get out another answer, that's 2 points. Graph these 2 points right here and here. Drag your asymptote value to +3, and it'll automatically create this graph for you. I hope this helps.